The morning mist clung to the Ohio River Valley like a shroud, carrying with it the acrid smell of burned timber and charred dreams. Thomas Whitmore pulled his woolen coat tighter as he walked through what remained of Meadowbrook, a settlement that just 3 days ago had been home to 47 souls. Now only blackened foundations and scattered belongings marked where families had built their lives. "Nothing salvageable here either," called his wife Margaret, her voice hollow as she picked through the debris of what had been the Miller family's cabin. Her auburn hair, usually pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, hung in disheveled strands around her face. The past 72 hours had aged her beyond her 32 years. Thomas nodded grimly, surveying the devastation. The raid had been swift and merciless. By the time the militia from Fort Hamilton had arrived, the attackers had vanished into the dense forest, leaving behind only death and destruction. He'd volunteered to help search for survivors, though in his heart he knew they'd find none. The October wind rustled through the skeletal remains of cornstalks in what had been the Johnsons' field. Thomas was about to suggest they move on to the next homestead when a sound stopped him cold. A soft whimper, barely audible above the wind. "Margaret," he whispered urgently, "do you hear that?" They both froze, listening intently. There it was again, a child's cry, weak and frightened, coming from the ruins of the largest cabin at the settlement's center. They rushed toward the sound, Thomas pulling aside charred beams and Margaret clearing away debris. Beneath what had once been a sturdy oak table, they found her. A little girl, perhaps 5 years old, her dark hair matted with ash, her small body wrapped in a tattered deerskin dress that marked her as Shawnee. "Dear God," Margaret breathed, her hands trembling as she reached for the child. "Sweetheart, it's all right. We're here to help." The girl's eyes, deep brown and wide with terror, darted between them like a trapped animal's. She spoke in rapid Shawnee, her voice cracking with thirst and fear. Though Thomas had picked up some of the language during his years trading with various tribes, he could only make out fragments. Hungry, afraid, mama. Margaret's maternal instincts overrode all else. Despite the child's obvious fear, she gently lifted her from her hiding place, murmuring soothing words. "Shh, little one. You're safe now. We won't hurt you." The girl was painfully thin, her lips cracked from dehydration. As Margaret cradled her, checking for injuries, she felt the child's body go limp with exhaustion and relief. The poor thing had likely been hiding for days, surviving on rainwater and whatever scraps she could find. Thomas watched his wife with a mixture of admiration and concern. Margaret had always possessed a fierce, protective streak, but it had been magnified tenfold since they'd lost their own daughter Sarah to fever 3 winters ago. He could see in her eyes that dangerous spark of hope, the kind that could either heal or destroy what remained of their wounded hearts. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, never taking her eyes off the child, "we can't leave her here. Look at her. She's all alone. Everyone she knew is—" "I know," he replied, though his practical mind was already racing through the complications. Taking in a Shawnee child during these volatile times would raise eyebrows at best and could potentially put them in danger at worst. The frontier was a powder keg of racial tensions, especially after recent raids. But looking at the girl's innocent face, he felt his resolve crumble. How could they abandon her? As they prepared to leave, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of their lives. Margaret had already begun speaking to the child in gentle, melodic tones, and though the girl didn't understand English, she seemed to respond to the kindness in Margaret's voice. The ride back to their farm 20 miles north passed in contemplative silence. The girl, whom they decided to call Hope, at least until they could determine her real name, had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms. Every so often, Thomas would glance back at his wife and feel his chest tighten with a complex mixture of love, fear, and something that felt dangerously like possibility. Their own homestead came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The modest log cabin sat in a cleared valley, surrounded by Thomas's carefully tended fields and Margaret's vegetable garden. Smoke rose from the chimney, their hired hand, Samuel, keeping the home fires burning. As they approached, Samuel emerged from the barn, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw their unexpected passenger. Thomas had known Samuel for over a decade, and the man's expression spoke volumes about the challenges that lay ahead. "Found her in the ruins of Meadowbrook," Thomas explained as he helped Margaret down from the wagon. "Couldn't very well leave her there." Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at the sleeping child. "Poor little thing. But Thomas, you know folks round here won't take kindly to—" "I know what folks will think," Thomas interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "But I also know what's right." That first night, Hope woke screaming from nightmares, her cries echoing through the cabin walls. Margaret rushed to comfort her, singing lullabies that Sarah used to love, while Thomas stood in the doorway, wrestling with doubts that gnawed at him like wolves. As Margaret finally got Hope back to sleep, she looked up at her husband with tears in her eyes. "She's been through something terrible, Thomas, something no child should endure." "I know," he said, settling into the chair beside the bed they'd prepared for Hope. "But Margaret, we have to be realistic about what we're taking on. She's Shawnee. There are people who will see her as the enemy, regardless of her age or innocence." "Then we'll protect her," Margaret said fiercely. "Just like we would have protected Sarah." The mention of their lost daughter hung heavy in the air between them. Thomas saw the pain in Margaret's eyes, the desperate hope that perhaps this child could fill the void that had consumed them both for 3 long years. He understood it because he felt it too, that treacherous whisper that maybe, just maybe, they'd been given a second chance at the family they'd lost. As dawn approached, Thomas made his decision. They would keep Hope, raise her as their own, and face whatever challenges came their way. He had no idea that this choice would set in motion a series of events that would test not only their love for each other, but their understanding of what it truly meant to be family. Outside, the October wind continued to blow, carrying with it the sense of change and the promise of a future none of them could have imagined. 5 years had passed since that fateful October morning, and the scared little girl they'd found in the ruins had blossomed into a spirited 10-year-old. Hope Whitmore, the only name she'd ever known, sat on the porch steps of the only home she could remember, carefully braiding sweetgrass that Margaret had taught her to gather from the meadows beyond their property. "Hope, come help me with these preserves," Margaret called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warmth that had become Hope's anchor in a sometimes confusing world. The girl looked up from her work, tucking a strand of long black hair behind her ear. In the 5 years since the Whitmores had taken her in, she'd grown tall and lean, her features sharpening into the elegant bone structure of her Shawnee heritage. But her mannerisms, her speech, her daily routines, all bore the influence of Margaret's patient teaching and Thomas's steady guidance. "Coming, Mama!" Hope called back, using the name that had come naturally to her within the first year of living with the Whitmores. She gathered her sweetgrass carefully, something about the way her fingers moved, the reverent attention she paid to each strand, seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious memory. In the kitchen, Margaret was stirring a large pot of apple butter, the sweet, spiced aroma filling the small space. She looked up as Hope entered, her face lighting up with the same maternal joy that had never dimmed in all these years. "Mrs. Patterson from town brought us apples from her orchard," Margaret explained, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought we'd make extra preserves to take to the Harvest Festival next week." Hope nodded eagerly. The Harvest Festival was one of her favorite events of the year, a time when the entire community gathered to celebrate the season's bounty. She loved the music, the dancing, and especially the stories the older folks would tell as the evening wore on. As they worked side by side, Hope couldn't help but notice how Margaret sometimes watched her with a mixture of pride and something else, something that looked almost like sadness. It was an expression she'd grown accustomed to over the years, though she'd never understood its source. "Mama," Hope said carefully, stirring the preserves as Margaret had taught her, "why do some people in town look at me strangely? Mrs. Fletcher always gets this pinched look when she sees me, and Billy Morrison called me a name last week that made Papa's face turn red." Margaret's stirring slowed, and Hope could see her choosing her words carefully. This wasn't the first time they'd had a conversation like this, but it seemed to grow more complicated each year as Hope became more aware of the world around her. "Some people," Margaret said finally, "have trouble understanding that families can be formed in different ways. They look at your beautiful dark hair and your lovely brown eyes, and they can't see past the differences to the wonderful girl you are." "But why?" Hope pressed. "I'm just like everyone else, aren't I?" Before Margaret could answer, Thomas's voice boomed from the front porch. "Hope, come out here, sweetheart. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Hope and Margaret exchanged curious glances before wiping their hands and heading outside. On the porch stood Thomas, alongside a man Hope had never seen before, tall and weathered, with steel-grey hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Hope," Thomas said, his voice carrying an unusual formality, "this is Captain William Clark. He's been traveling through the territory, documenting the various peoples and customs of our region." Captain Clark stepped forward, offering a respectful nod to both Margaret and Hope. When his eyes settled on Hope, she noticed a flicker of recognition, or perhaps understanding, cross his features. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Hope," Clark said, his voice gentle but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Your father tells me you're quite the scholar, learning to read and write, helping with the farm, and from what I can see, mastering the domestic arts as well." Hope felt herself blush at the praise. "Papa's been teaching me letters and numbers," she said shyly, "and Mama's shown me how to preserve foods and tend the garden." "Remarkable," Clark mused, though Hope sensed he was referring to more than just her education. "Tell me, child, do you remember anything from before you came to live with the Whitmores?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Hope frowned, searching her memory for any trace of life before this farm, before Margaret's lullabies and Thomas's patient lessons. But there was nothing, just fragments of dreams that felt more like shadows than memories. "Not really," she admitted. "Sometimes I have dreams, but they're all mixed up and scary." Clark nodded thoughtfully. "That's not uncommon for someone who experienced trauma at such a young age. The mind has ways of protecting us from memories too painful to bear." As the adults continued their conversation, Hope found herself studying Captain Clark more closely. There was something about the way he looked at her, not with the suspicious curiosity she'd grown accustomed to from some townspeople, but with genuine interest and what seemed like respect. "Captain Clark has been documenting the customs and languages of various tribes throughout the territory," Thomas explained. "He's particularly knowledgeable about the Shawnee people." At the mention of Shawnee, Hope felt a strange stirring in her chest, not quite recognition, but something deeper and more primal. It was a word she'd heard whispered in town, usually accompanied by furtive glances in her direction, but no one had ever explained its significance to her directly. "The Shawnee are a proud people," Clark said, his eyes never leaving Hope's face. "They have rich traditions of storytelling, craft-making, and deep spiritual connections to the land. They're also fiercely protective of their families and incredibly resilient in the face of adversity." Something in his tone made Hope stand straighter, as if he were describing something important about her personally, rather than just sharing general knowledge. That evening, after Captain Clark had departed with promises to return if his travels brought him through the area again, Hope sat with Thomas and Margaret by the fireplace. The conversation with the captain had stirred something in her, questions that had been dormant for years, suddenly demanding answers. "Papa?" she began hesitantly. "Captain Clark seemed to know something about me that I don't know about myself." Thomas set down his newspaper, giving Hope his full attention. Margaret's hands stilled over her mending. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" When he talked about the Shawnee people, I felt something, like he was talking about family I'd never met. Hope struggled to find the words for the complex emotions churning inside her. "Am I Shawnee, Papa?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged a long look across the small room. In that moment, Hope realized that her question hadn't surprised them. They'd been waiting for it, perhaps dreading it. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "We believe you are." The simple admission opened a floodgate of questions, but before Hope could voice them, Margaret moved to sit beside her on the hearth. "We found you," Margaret explained gently, "in the ruins of a settlement that had been attacked. You were alone, frightened, and speaking a language we couldn't understand. We brought you home because we couldn't bear to leave you there, and because—" her voice caught, "because we'd lost our own little girl and you needed parents as much as we needed a daughter." Hope absorbed this information, her mind racing. "So my real parents—" "We don't know what happened to them," Thomas said honestly. "But Hope, I want you to understand something very clearly. You are our daughter now. You have been from the moment we brought you home. Nothing about your heritage changes that." Hope nodded, though inside she felt as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. She was Shawnee, a people Captain Clark had described with obvious respect and admiration. But she was also Hope Whitmore, daughter of Thomas and Margaret, raised in the customs and traditions of colonial frontier life. "Will you tell me more about the Shawnee?" she asked softly. "About my people?" Thomas smiled, though she could see the concern in his eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll learn together." As they sat together that evening, Hope felt as if she were standing at the threshold of a great discovery. She had no way of knowing that this newfound awareness of her heritage would soon put her family's love and their safety to the ultimate test. Outside, the October wind carried the same restless energy it had 5 years ago, whispering of changes yet to come. The harsh winter of 1801 gave way to a turbulent spring, and with it came news that would shatter the fragile peace Hope had known for the past 6 years. She was now 15, tall and graceful, with the kind of quiet strength that drew people to her, despite the whispered doubts of some in the community. Her education under Thomas's tutelage had made her one of the most well-read young people in the county, while Margaret's patient instruction had taught her all the domestic skills expected of a frontier woman. But it was the knowledge she'd gained about her Shawnee heritage, through books, conversations with travelers like Captain Clark, and her own growing connection to the natural world around her, that had begun to shape her sense of identity in ways that sometimes troubled her adoptive parents. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Hope was in the garden, tending to the early vegetables Margaret had planted, when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. She straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and saw a group of men riding hard toward their farmstead. Thomas emerged from the barn, his face tense with concern. Unexpected visitors, especially groups of armed men, were rarely bearers of good news on the frontier. "Hope!" he called out, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. "Go inside to your mother, now." Something in his tone made her obey immediately. She found Margaret in the kitchen, her hands flour-dusted from the morning's bread-making, but her expression alert with worry. "What's happening, Mama?" Before Margaret could answer, they heard Thomas's voice from the yard, raised in greeting but cautious. "Gentlemen, what brings you to my farm this morning?" Hope moved to the window, peering through the simple curtains Margaret had sewn. She counted 6 men, all armed. Their leader, a thick-set man with graying hair and hard eyes that she recognized as Sheriff Dawson from the county seat. "Thomas Whitmore," the sheriff called out, remaining mounted while his men formed a loose circle around Thomas. "We need to discuss the Indian girl you've been harboring." Hope's blood ran cold. Margaret's hand found her shoulder, squeezing tightly. "Hope is my daughter," Thomas replied, his voice steady but with an undertone of steel. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd refer to her as such." "Your daughter," Sheriff Dawson repeated with obvious skepticism. "Thomas, we've received reports about increased Indian activity in the region, raiding parties, stolen livestock, settlements threatened. Some folks are concerned that having a Shawnee girl in your house might be compromising your loyalties." Hope felt Margaret's grip tighten. Through the window, she could see Thomas's posture stiffen with barely controlled anger. "Sheriff," Thomas said carefully, "Hope has been part of my family for 6 years. She's never been further than 20 miles from this farm, speaks English better than half your deputies, and has shown nothing but love and loyalty to this community. What exactly are you implying?" One of the other men, whom Hope recognized as Mr. Bradley from the mercantile in town, spoke up. "Come now, Thomas. You can't expect us to believe that blood doesn't call to blood. She's Indian. You found her in the ruins of an attack, for God's sake. How do we know she's not passing information to her people about our defenses, our routines?" "Her people?" Thomas's voice rose with indignation. "Her people are standing right here. We're her family, and this community is her home. I won't stand here and listen to you speak about my daughter as if she were some kind of spy." Hope had heard enough. Despite Margaret's restraining hand, she moved toward the door. She couldn't let Thomas face this alone, not when it was her presence that was putting him in danger. "Hope, no," Margaret whispered urgently, but Hope was already stepping onto the porch. The conversation died as she appeared. Hope felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes studying her, evaluating her, judging her. She was acutely aware of her appearance in that moment. Her long black hair braided in the neat style Margaret had taught her, her simple but well-made dress, her posture straight and dignified, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I understand you have concerns about me. Perhaps you'd like to hear from me directly, rather than debating my character as if I weren't present." Sheriff Dawson's eyebrows rose with what might have been surprise or grudging respect. "Well then, Miss Whitmore, is it? Tell me, do you remember anything about your life before the Whitmores took you in?" "Very little," Hope replied honestly. "I remember fear and cold and hunger. I remember hiding and being afraid. And then I remember Papa lifting me up and Mama singing to me and feeling safe for the first time in what seemed like forever." "But you've learned about your original people, haven't you?" Mr. Bradley pressed. "About their ways, their customs." Hope nodded. "I've learned that the Shawnee are a people of honor, who love their families and protect their communities fiercely. I've learned that they have rich traditions of storytelling and craftsmanship. I've learned that they value courage, loyalty, and respect for the natural world." She paused, meeting each man's gaze steadily. "I've also learned that these are values I share, regardless of my blood, because they're the same values Papa and Mama have taught me." "Pretty words," Sheriff Dawson said, though his tone had lost some of its hardness. "But the fact remains, there's been Indian trouble, and some folks are nervous about having you in their midst." "Then perhaps," Hope said quietly, "those folks should get to know me before judging me based on something I had no choice in, the circumstances of my birth." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, and Hope could see him reassessing his preconceptions. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But understand, Miss Whitmore, that if there's any trouble, any at all, that can be connected to your presence here. I'll be back, and next time the conversation might not be so civil." As the men rode away, Hope found herself shaking with a mixture of anger, fear, and something that felt like awakening. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, and Margaret joined them on the porch, all three watching until the riders disappeared beyond the tree line. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Thomas said quietly. "I'd hoped we could protect you from this kind of ignorance." "It's not your fault, Papa," Hope said, her voice steady, "but I need to understand who I really am. The whole story, even the hard parts. Why people like Sheriff Dawson look at me with suspicion." That evening at dinner, she made a life-changing decision. "Papa, Mama," she began seriously, "I want to find my birth family. I need to know where I came from and what it means to be Shawnee." Margaret turned pale. "Hope, that could be dangerous." "That's exactly why I have to go," Hope replied gently. "I'm caught between two worlds. Until I understand both, I'll never truly belong." Thomas sat quietly, then spoke with warmth. "If this is what you need, we'll help you. Just remember, no matter what you find, you'll always be our daughter." Hope reached for their hands, eyes brimming with tears. "I know, and you'll always be my parents. But I have to find out who Hope Whitmore really is." Outside, storm clouds gathered, and the wind carried the scent of change. Hope stood at the crossroads of her life, ready to seek her truth and her place in the world. 3 months after Sheriff Dawson's visit, Hope rode alongside Running Wolf, a Shawnee guide, deep into the Ohio wilderness. They were seeking her birth family, a journey that Thomas and Margaret had reluctantly agreed to, with promises she'd return within 2 months. When they reached the Shawnee settlement, Hope's heart pounded with recognition. The lodges arranged in a circle, the sounds of daily life, it all felt both foreign and familiar. "Your grandmother lives here," Running Wolf said quietly. "White Dove. She has been hoping for many seasons that you would return." An elderly woman emerged from a lodge, her hair white as snow. She took one look at Hope and whispered, "Waseaban," morning light, her Shawnee name. The reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. White Dove shared stories of Hope's early childhood and revealed that her mother had dreamed of Hope becoming a bridge between two worlds, a peacemaker who would help prevent the violence that had destroyed their settlement. During her stay, Hope faced suspicion from some tribal members, particularly Black Hawk, who questioned her loyalty. At a council meeting, she spoke honestly about living between two worlds and her desire to honor both her heritage and her adopted family. "I don't want to choose between these two parts of myself," she declared. "I want to understand both, to honor both, and perhaps to help both sides see that we don't have to be enemies." Her sincerity gradually won over many skeptics. She spent weeks learning traditional crafts, discovering an unexpected talent for beadwork that seemed to flow from ancestral memory. When time came to leave, several tribe members encouraged her to stay permanently. But Hope knew she had to return to the Whitmores, carrying with her grandmother's medicine bag and a deeper understanding of her identity. The reunion at the farmstead was everything she'd hoped for. That evening, she shared her journey with Thomas and Margaret, explaining how the experience had deepened her appreciation for the family who had saved and raised her. "I want to find a way to bridge the gap between our peoples," she told them. "There's so much fear and misunderstanding." Their conversation was interrupted by Samuel, their hired hand, arriving with terrible news. The Morrison farm had been attacked by Indians. Billy Morrison was badly hurt, his father dead, and their house burned. Worse still, townspeople were connecting Hope's absence to the timing of the attack, suggesting she might have provided information to the raiders. Despite the danger, Hope insisted on going to town to face the accusations directly. At the confrontation, Sheriff Dawson questioned her publicly, while an angry crowd gathered. Jake Morrison, Billy's uncle, was particularly hostile, accusing her of betraying the community. The tide turned when Captain Clark stepped forward, revealing he'd witnessed Hope's peaceful activities at the settlement and vouching for the non-violent nature of her grandmother's people. Then Billy Morrison himself appeared, weak but determined to set the record straight. The raiders knew nothing about Hope, Billy testified. They were looking for Indian allies in the area and seemed surprised when told there weren't any. His words cleared Hope of suspicion, though not everyone was entirely convinced. As they rode home, Hope announced her decision. "I want to become a teacher, not just of reading and writing, but of understanding. I want to help children, both settler and Indian, learn about each other's cultures." That evening, as they planned for the future, Hope reflected on her journey. She had faced suspicion and hatred, but had also witnessed people choosing understanding over prejudice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready to begin the work of building bridges between two worlds, carrying within her the wisdom of both cultures and her mother's prophetic dream of peace.